Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar. A very good afternoon. Welcome to the 15th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce the economics of soil. This session is presented by Escorts. What if civilization did not mean a plunge into What forms of social and economic organization could settled agriculture lead to? The answers are often unexpected. How can we reimagine rural regions as spaces for enabling ideas like fraternity and democracy? How do the economics of the soil can help cultivate or effect collective identity? Exploring these possibilities are panelists, social anthropologist Mukulika Banerjee, journalist and writer Jaideep Hardikar, and sociologist Surinder S. Jodhka. Jaideep Hardikar is a Nagpur-based journalist, writer, and researcher, and currently a roving reporter of the People's Archive of Rural India. He is the author of A Village Awaits Doomsday, published by Penguin India, and Ramrao, The Story of India's Farm Crisis, published by HarperCollins. Hardikar is working on his next book in the New India Foundation Fellowship. Mukulika Banerjee is a professor at LSE and was the inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Center from 2015 to 2000. She has published extensively on Indian democracy, and her brand new book, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India, published by Oxford University in 21-22. Surinder S. Jodhka is a professor of sociology at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and an honorary fellow at the Centre de Sciences Humaines, New Delhi. His publications include Caste in Contemporary India, the Indian Middle Class, and Mapping the Elite, Power, Privilege, and Inequality. Thank you. Over to you. They will be in conversation in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JLF, for inviting us to talk about soil and agriculture once again. We've had a couple of sessions on this already, and we've been discussing these things, and this has fortunately in some sense become subject that we have begun to talk about again, which we had nearly forgotten. And in some sense, the title of this session is Economy or Soil. And what in some sense brings us together, the three of us, none of us is not only an economist, but we also, all of us agree that when we think about soil and agriculture, we should not think of it primarily from a kind of economic perspective. We also need to think of soil as life, as culture, as livelihoods, as communities, as kind of, connecting to how we reproduce ourselves. And soil in some sense is also a metaphor for the nation. Land, zameen, and a mitti. Mitti is not something that we have plenty of songs in Hindi movies which begin with mitti and end with mitti, and mitti is also something that we kind of lay in or become ashes and become part of mitti. So it's kind of also a metaphor for life, and that's what we are trying to in some sense talk about soil in the present day session. And it's not simply a question of our disciplinary specialization, that Mukulika is a professor of anthropology, Jaideep works on agriculture related issues and has a degree in sociology, or I teach sociology, or professor of sociology. It's not simply a disciplinary question. It's something that we have in some sense been thinking about, and we have been discussing this in our own capacity. And we have come to kind of think about it, that we need to talk about agriculture as much more than question of national income and how much share agriculture contributes to national income, and whether agriculture should be subsidized by the state, or how much emphasis should be given to agriculture in the national economy, and how should it be integrated with the market systems. It's not just about that. I mean, we have seen how farmers sat on the borders of Delhi, where more than 700 people died. They did not only fight for kind of higher prices. It was much more than that. They were talking about hond. In Punjabi, hond means your own sense of being. And this is something that we need to, in some sense, also emphasize. More importantly, ever since we have been talking about agriculture as an economy, it also brings in question of state, question of policy. We have been talking about green revolution. We have been talking about water. We have been talking about the quality of food. We have been talking about how it gets circulated, who produces, who in some sense transforms into edible kind of, whether it is wheat flour or oils, or, now largely we have processed food in many countries. You eat cornflakes, and many of us don't even know where milk comes from. Milk comes in bottle and it is supplied to us in packets. We have never, perhaps some of us or our coming generation, or if you go to a European country, they would not have seen perhaps a cow or a buffalo. It's only in a zoo that you would see a cow. And this is something that we need to, at some level, avoid. Another thing about soil, before I pass on to other, is what we have been talking about, that it is also about culture. Culture is our way of life, as I was telling you about home. And culture is a much bigger word. Culture includes everything. It doesn't include only a question of song and dance. Culture also includes the way we culture, agriculture. And that's why it's called culture. And that's where we need to, in some sense, go back. If we have to talk about agriculture, beyond economy, we also need to think about agriculture as culture. Now let me pass on to Mukulika, who has recently published this book called Cultivating Democracy. And I was very impressed when I looked at the title. The point that I've just made you, I think it's in some sense also conveyed through just the title of this book, Cultivating Democracy, cultivation of democracy. And this is something that Mukulika will perhaps tell us, why did she use this word, and why did she think that it should be invoked both to talk about politics, but also talk about agriculture, in the sense that when you're using the word cultivation, she obviously is referring to rural life, and that's where empirical work has been. Over to Mukulika.
Thank you very much. And I just want to tell the students who are leaving the room that you were a very noisy presence in the room, which is not very nice for speakers and everybody else. So you're welcome to stay. You can stay quietly, but please don't talk when you're in here. About cultivation, it's true that it's interesting, the discussion of cultivation as both a practice and a metaphor is kind of what we are getting at, what Surinder has been saying. And when the three of us were chatting earlier, we wanted to make this conversation about having this discussion about soil as metaphor and soil as a material in tandem. And Ambedkar shows us the way, in his observation in the constitutional debates when the Indian Constitution was being written. And I quote it in the book because it's such a fantastic sentence and a bleak sentence, because he says, democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil which is essentially undemocratic. Yeah, democracy is only a top dressing. It's like you're sprinkling democracy, over a soil that is essentially undemocratic. And of course, what he was getting at was the deep caste divisions. And as Pratap Bhanumehta has argued, the burden of democracy, therefore, is to bring in some sense of equity, of lifting. The burden is to bring in social equality alongside political equality. We get political equality through democratic institutions, but creating democratic culture and social equality is much harder. And this is where to what you were saying, Surinder, about using cultivation. The reason why I was interested in it is because farmers and the act of cultivation is a very good way to understand what each of us needs to do as a citizen. Is there anyone in this room who is not a citizen of India? We are all citizens here, right? So if you're a citizen of India, what are our duties? Our duties are, yes, to go and vote in every election. That's a very basic, as people say, ye to maulik adhikar hai. It's a foundational right. But we have to do something more than that. And that is what the metaphor of cultivation is, which is that you make the soil in which you're trying to grow these democratic institutions conducive. So if you have social inequality, if you have discrimination, if you have institutions that are being corrupted, either by political interference or by money, then it is our job to be vigilant, like farmers are vigilant. When you're trying to grow a crop, you don't just plant the crop and then disappear and hope that in 3 months' time you come back and you'll find grain that you can harvest. You have to be there every single day. So elections are like that moment where you plant the crop and when you come to harvest. And people think that if you just plant it and disappear, you can come back in 5 years and reap the benefits. It doesn't work like that. You've got to look after that crop every single day. And this is something that I think all three of us who've been working in agrarian settings with farmers wanted to draw attention to this idea that cultivation as an activity is one that teaches us how to be active citizens, because without this kind of active citizenship, there is no democracy. We have the shell of a democracy. We have the semblance, the sham of a democracy. And I would argue, really, have been studying Indian democracy for more than 20 years, I would say we are constantly degenerating at the moment. Not because some international indicators have told us that India's, we are lower on the index. It's because the democratic standards in India were better in the past and we are declining.
Maybe just one point that she's already made, connected with kind of agriculture. When we are talking about democracy, we tend to think about democracy as a kind of political system coming to us from above. Elections are kind of declared by election commission, and then we make a kind of government in Delhi. But also a question of democracy would involve thinking about people who are involved in various occupations, living in rural areas. Increasingly post-90s, we have seen citizen as in some sense tend to be only the person who lives in the city. And we have tended to look at rural residents as ignorant, stupid people who do not know what is good for them. And those who are educated, they would anyway move to city. Those who are left behind, we look at them, people left behind. And this is an imagination which in some sense, it counters the idea of democracy. And as I think that's what farmers were trying to say. And if you look at their language, the way they conducted their movement, they set up townships outside Delhi. And that itself was a symbol of their own urbanity and their own cosmopolitanism. Just because somebody lives in the village does not mean that they are left behind and they don't have the choice of going out. Perhaps they also want to go out. And this is in some sense crisis of being, which Jaideep has been studying. He has published a book on which is called Ramrao, a farmer who wanted to commit suicide. And then he told him the story about his life and his other work. Maybe he can also comment on the theme that we are talking about.
Thank you, Dr. Jodhka, and thank you, Mukulika Madam, and thanks, JLF, for inviting me to place my views. I'll take the leaf from soil as a metaphor and soil as a physical construct. Allow me a couple of minutes to explain what it means. One question that I asked Ramrao once was, what does this land and soil mean to you? And he has a sense of humor. Vidarbha, the region I come from, has a sense of dark humor. And he says, "Sau ka saat karna, baap ka naam chalana." In one line, let me explain how he uses soil and land as a metaphor. Sau ka saat karna is economics. Basically, he's telling us that I invest 100 rupees and actually draw 60 rupees out of it, which means that I'm every year ending up with losses. That's the economics of it. That's the economics of agriculture that he sort of defined in that one line. But Baap Ka Naam Chalana is a metaphor of he being part of a system. Call it patriarchy, call it a continuous process where a soil or land is passed on from one generation to another. And therefore, all through my reporting as a journalist from the hinterland and heartlands of the country, reporting on farming societies, agrarian masses, I realized that a soil is probably a less acknowledged construct of civilization. Allow me to explain what I mean. It's the only construct that is continuous from the time the planet has come into being. Soil as a metaphor, can be an emblem or a symbol of nationalism. In the pre and post-independence India, until the neoliberal economy engulfed all of us, it was peasant nationalism. So, mere desh ki mitti, sona ugle ugle hire moti, and all that sort of thing. And now it's the other sort of masculine nationalism that soil represents. Tere mitti mein mil jawa, on all those modern songs herald that transition. Soil is also a philosophical construct in many ways. From the Hindu texts, soil is part of Pancha Mahatattva, is a sort of a philosophical construct. Soil to me is also a very, very complex system, which probably can only be comprehended or explained and understood by applying almost every single discipline that we can think of. We can think of social sciences to understand the agrarian societies that are built on farming, the landless communities, or the system of agriculture where we have to see the traditional livestock rearers who use soil. And therefore, I think Ramrao's one single sentence explains merely the problems in agriculture, that he invests 100 rupees and extracts only 60 out of it in transactional sense. That's what soil we have reduced to. But soil also, in modern life systems, soil is also breeding unequal societies. And that, I think, emerges from the agriculture, birth of agriculture, the spread of agriculture, and the different paths humanity took in different parts of the world. Agriculture probably originated in 13 or 14 different regions in the world. And each single region took a different path. But to make my last point, I think apart from problems in agriculture, the problems of agriculture that are also equally important, where soil has to be viewed as a living construct, as a physical construct, which is in deep crisis. I'll explain to it if I get a chance to. But climate change and soil erosion is essentially probably at the root of many crises that we are confronted with. And it's also a crisis that is less acknowledged. We are only dealing with the economic and the social side of soil economy, but we're not dealing with soil as a living, living system, which is in deep stress as we are extracting and eroding our soil systems by use of modern practices of agriculture.
If I may just come in on one aspect, I think the point you've ended on is critical, right? What's happening with the Green Revolution and what it has done to the soil in India, what monocropping has done to the soil in India, the fact that we've lost our cereal diversity, we grow wheat and paddy, and that's what we eat. We don't eat the traditional grains and this is not just what it has done for nutrition for us, but also what growing different crops does to the nutrition in the soil itself. And farmers in India, I mean, certainly where I work in West Bengal, people understand that you need to grow potato in between other, say, wheat, because potato plant nourishes the soil with certain nutrients which wheat takes out. So there is an understanding of soil science that is traditional that we need to recognize. But if I can just backpedal for 1 minute about productivity and soil, because this is the issue that we are talking about, there is an issue of soil and labor, is how we work this, right? That's at the heart of what we get out of it. And because I've studied West Bengal, and my book is based on 20 years of engagement in a village in West Bengal, one of the things we saw in West Bengal was the Green Revolution and what it's done to the soil, which is a separate story. But 20 years ago, the story was alongside Green Revolution, there was also land reform. So suddenly, people who were agricultural labor, people who were actually doing the work, not just people who owned the land, were getting a much better wage. So daily wage went up, the entitlement to land went up. And economists, when they are creative, economists can do amazing work. They showed us that they were trying to explain, what happened when they did institutional reforms like this, where they tried to make a more democratic culture by making access and ownership of land more equitable. The productivity of the soil went up, and West Bengal became the largest producing state of paddy. And this was a puzzle. You thought, humne to land reform kiya. How does the soil know we are doing land reform? After all, you think the soil will produce. And there's this very interesting debate which tries to explain whether how you work the land, what attitude you have, whether you own the land and you're putting your own labor in, whether that increases productivity or not. And if you compare West Bengal to Bangladesh, where it has exactly the same soil conditions, has exactly the same kind of paddy crop growing, they also had yielding varieties. They did not, but they didn't have land reform. And this is the connection to democracy, that if you can dignify labor, people who work the soil, if you pay them decent wages and give them more certainty so they're not trying to kill themselves, then it is not only good for the farmer, it is actually good for farming.
I think one point which we are trying to make is not to also romanticize the idea of soil. We are not saying that we should go back to kind of primitive agriculture or traditional agriculture where people lived together in communities and they cultivated various crops as they wanted, and because of mechanization, because of development, because of green revolution, things have become bad. Yes, they have become bad, but we should also recognize that agriculture or soil is also about livelihood, is also about working on soil as cultivators. And when you work on soil as cultivators, it is also a question of relationships. And those relationships happen at two levels. One is the level of relationship of human beings to the land or to the soil, but also relationship between each other, with each other. The point that Mukulika was making about land reforms, it was also transforming a structure of relationships where somebody owned all the land and everyone else worked as his slaves. It was always landlords, almost always men. So there was also a kind of patriarchal structure, which also comes to the household that Jaideep was talking about, men, women, and men go out and women are not valued in agrarian societies. There are many problems. So one is not talking about romanticizing soil and saying that this development has meant disaster for traditional cultures and modernity is the source of all the problems. That is the last thing that we would like to do. So the question of, I think the point that Jaideep was pointing to and Mukulika is saying, there are two different things that are happening to these relationships. One is a process of democratization. That's why cultivating democracy is like cultivating a crop. You have to work in it, you have to work together, you have to kind of make sure that there are no pests and there are no insects in the seeds, and we have to keep cleaning them, right? That is one level. At another level, kind of connection with market, and that's what has created many problems, and that leads to a different kind of capitalist logic in a context which is very different. And that leads to a different kind of individualization and fragmentation of all kinds of collective life we have had in the village. All of us who have worked in villages, and all of you who, even if you don't live in village, you would have relatives in villages. And if you go to villages, you don't recognize them. Even in last 20 years, rural settlements have changed so much. They have changed not only physically, that there are pakka streets and there is water and there is light, but relationally also within families, there are so many crises. Agriculture has become a kind of bone of contention on land. People kill each other. So what kind of alternative collective we could think of, right? Can we go back to a community life? I think we can reflect, all of us, a little bit on this. Maybe I'll start with Jaideep and he can comment something. He's also been working with question of cooperatives and collectives, different kinds of experiments that are already going on. And we need to talk about them so that, farmers don't feel lonely, isolated, individualized, and they feel that, if there is a kind of crisis of debt, the only source they have is to kind of hang themselves. Yeah.
No, I think I look at collectives from the point of view of market viability and also a kind of threshold of threshold of productivity and production. But I think at the core of it is to have a realization that soil is not a finite source, just as oil or any non-renewable source of energy. It's a finite, so it's not an infinite source. So that sort of awakening has to occur, not just among the masses that are agrarian, but also those like us who are not part of the agriculture economy or the so-called productive economy. I think the two processes are intrinsic in the country today. One is the whole disconnect between the productive societies or the agrarian and industrial societies and the societies that are now increasingly driven by service sector. And also technology plays an important part in driving a new kind of society. And their disconnect is, I think, at the root. While one is a consuming society, which is deriving, wanting cheap food, which is, I think, the core of the economic problem of soil. Can food be a cheap thing if the energy costs, the costs of labor, the costs of extractive economy are growing every passing year, every passing day? And I think to fit into that sort of market economy, people would try and find solutions. So while I'm saying that we cannot have solutions from the existing framework, I mean, to sort of agree and disagree with your point, it's not the question of organic and inorganic. We have to look at system of agriculture where we transform perennial systems into annual systems, and that's where the problem began. Food was not a part of annualized system. It became much later, and through it emerged the agrarian or the agricultural transformations that we know today. And then we've added technology, added inorganic. But within the existing framework, India's problem is that we are a predominantly dry land as well as small farmer economy. 83% of Indian farmers, Indian cultivators, are either tenant farmers or small and marginal farmers who cannot stand the pressures of market economy, who cannot fulfill the very basic demands and needs, whether education of children or the kind of aspirations that are growing in society. So what's the way out? While Ramrao's, I've reported on almost 7,000-8,000 farm suicides over the last 25 years, and every single time, every single case study points to the isolation and the complete annihilation of this farmer from the market economy. Small little things become difficult, and therefore the whole, we're talking about the upward social mobility, all those dreams fall apart. And therefore, with last submission is, I'm also seeing that wherever communities are collectively coming together, whether for an intervention in the market or whether sort of a collective use of resources such as water, land, forests, those communities they stand a better chance. Those collectives, not necessarily homogeneous, caste, they could be from different caste and religious lines, but bound by one single or one common interest, definitely stand a better chance. This is what, and you see, and I'll make my final submission. I believe that in the rural societies, the next big thing is not going to be a radical, big transformative sort of solution, but there will be a series of smaller interventions, smaller solutions, not really adaptable or not really replicable. Those would be non-replicable, geographic specific, solutions, and that's where collectives and commons are very important.
That's a very good point for me to come in on, if I may. Yes, they are local, but there is something about any village. It's very interesting. There's a new book by the historian Niladri Bhattacharya. It's called The Agrarian Conquest of India. And what he shows in this book, it's a new book, it's come out this year, last year. The village, we all talk about village India, villages. You know, village is a fairly recent unit. The villages have not existed forever. The village is a revenue unit from the colonial period. So these are not ancient, there's nothing ancient about our rural societies. The societies have existed, but the village, demarcated as it is a revenue unit which was used by the colonial government to tax. Now, what it did was these had to be geographically marked. So what do you geographically mark? The settled bit of the village, where people live and where their fields are. The fields, by definition, are privately owned. So there is a question of ownership. So you know this is X's field, this is Y's field. But that's not all the village is. The village also consisted of, in Bengal, you have pukurs, tanks, rain-fed tanks. You have bamboo groves. You have pasture land where the animals go to graze. And there are, so if you look at the map of India according to villages, you'll see that these defined units are interleaved by these commons. And there are two different logics at work. One of private ownership, exploitation, unequal labor, caste, and people have to behave and do behave in certain ways. But there is a whole other way of behaving, which is, if there is, I was saying this in an earlier session, you know, there are lots of bamboo groves in my village where I do my research. Now, bamboo grows, if you've seen bamboo, it grows profusely and it's beautiful. It's one of them. But you use what? 1 or 2 cane, they're about 10 feet tall, to make for the scaffolding for your hut. So you need to rethatch your hut, you go and help yourself to 2 canes, 3 canes of bamboo. If you start cutting a 4th or a 5th cane, people will say, what are you going to do with this? You can't take it and sell it because this is a common. So when there is a common resource that everybody shares, like rain-fed water tanks, like bamboo groves, like pasture lands, you look after it in different ways. And it requires you to be a different kind of person. And I would argue that it requires, you know, this is the kind of person we want and need in a democracy. So actually so when we talk about cultivating democracy, the social imaginaries, the values for being democratic citizen exists in those modes of action in rural India.
I think another point that kind of comes out of this discussion, that the 2 points being made. One is question of diversity cannot be ignored. There are different kinds of diversities. Agrarian histories of Britain could have never been like ours, right? We are ex-colonial country. The fact that India was colonized shaped the way we live today, shaped the nature of our settlements, shaped the identity of our settlements, shaped the relationship between different settlements. Similarly, what I think Jaideep was saying is also very, very critical. Agrarian systems are inherently diverse because our ecologies are very diverse. South Odisha cannot be similar to North Odisha because land systems are very different. You know, if you look at Kerala, you don't really have villages even now. The village settlements have not evolved in the manner in which they have evolved in North India. You have contiguous kind of settlements, and now there are these bus addas which you have some kind of name for. But again, within Kerala also, if you go to some areas where you have plain lands, where you have rice cultivation, relationships change there. Ecologies of hills are very different from ecologies of plain. Size of rural settlements are very different. In Himachal Pradesh, a settlement would be of 50 households, and in Bihar, a settlement could be of 3,000 households, 20,000 population, 30,000 population in one village. In Bihar, a contiguous settlement. So ruralities are by definition very, very diverse, and more importantly, agrarian histories are inherently diverse. And this, in some sense, becomes a very important policy question. And that's where question of hegemony becomes very significant. And we think that what happened in North America will also happen in India. What happened in Central Europe also happens in India. We don't have peasant societies in the sense in which Central Europe had peasant societies. We have always had caste divided societies. And caste remains a very central institution in most of India, not all of India. Now, where it is not significant, we should not superimpose the idea of caste. where you have so-called tribal communities, their customs are different. Their relationship with each other is different. Their relationship with land is very different. Their imaginations of the larger world is very different. So imagination of diversities has to be inherent when we are talking about soil and agrarian kind of questions. And if we have to think about, in some sense, futures, not of going back to past, when we are talking about cultivating democracies, we are not talking about rural-urban binaries. In those hegemonies, we are also involved. We middle-class Indians think that we know what is good for them. Who will speak for the village, I think, is very, very critical. We need to listen to them. They know how to speak for themselves. They have spoken for themselves. We have seen how articulate they were. If you were following Facebook channels and farmers' videos, they're so articulate, they're so sophisticated, they're so cosmopolitan. They knew everything, all connection between what was happening in Canada and United States and what is happening in villages of Bengal and Odisha, apart from Punjab and Haryana and Western UP. Not that they are not knowledgeable. His only thing is that we don't think that they have capacity to speak, and what they speak is worth listening. And that's where I think we can now perhaps move to your responses, and then we'll come back for 2 minutes each if we have anything to say. If there is anyone who would give them mic, there are 2-3 hands raised. Yeah, please.
I think this is a wonderful session, and Jaideep spoke very well. You see that there are 3 challenges, and you have covered very well. One is disruption, disconnect, and contradiction. If you define agriculture to value chain, this is happening, And this recent farmer law and dissent to voice has made that this session is there in JLF. We are talking about agriculture. So we have a lot of agriculture colleges where lakhs of BSc, MSc agriculture persons are coming out graduating. They either become scientists, but they never become farmers. So this is one of the complete disconnect.
Yes.
We are talking of MSME, sir. We are talking of farmer as a production, but we never allow Swaminathan report that we make them entrepreneur. Why cannot we define a farmer under MSME Act? Ultimately, he's producing. He's using land as a revenue, as Madam has rightly said. So these are the contradictions. We talk, and we are ready to give 5 kilogram rice to that same farmer who is growing it under the, under 80 crore rupees, 80 crore population which has come under, poverty. So these are the all contradictions. And lastly, a lot of startups are coming up. They have become billionaire, and they are related to farming. Ninja Cart, all these things, and they are only using the farm produce to value addition to market. So these 3-4 definitions are very simple. Somewhere we need to understand how to connect, how we understand disruption, which is going to place with social media, as Surinder Singh rightly said, that farmers are speaking so well, they understand now, and how we connect those agriculture institutions to real farming and ensure that our farmer productivity becomes world class like Canada or whatever else developed nations. Thank you, sir.
Should I? Yeah. Thank you very much for this reflection.
Questions? Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Ma'am, my question is to you.
Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
So earlier during the British era, we saw that the zamindars or the talukdars probably, they controlled the land. And later on, you talked about democratization of the land process, in which land reforms were done in West Bengal and in Kerala specifically, where they were successful. But now when we see, we are again moving towards a contractual farm labor, wherein big companies come in and they try to employ these farmers. So how do you see this, and how does it go against the process of democratization?
पीछे, yeah, please. आप खड़े हो जाइए. Yeah.
Hello.
हाँ जी.
I am farmer in Maharashtra. Now I am facing the problem of non-fertility of land, and I want to know how to improve the quality of soil and fertility of land.
Please. Yes, there are 2 questions there. One by one. We can take all the questions and finally we conclude.
So India has a productivity, its yields are generally less than half of the global average, right? And, consequently our incomes are very, very bad. And yet the destruction of the environment because of agriculture is enormous. And as Ambedkar said, the villages, after all, are a den of caste, and they're not very nice places, according to Ambedkar. So why is it that we want to perpetuate this? We should probably pay people to not sow their land, right, and get them off, because we're being environmentally destructive. We don't have the yield. We're losing money, and we're perpetuating caste in that name.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Hello. As an urban person, I see this news of farmers committing suicide, and it makes me very sad and also a little confused, because one reads about farmers not having to pay income tax, farmers getting free seed, fertilizers, support, minimum fixed price, and stuff like that. So what is this disconnect in which is so bad that the farmer cannot make a living and has to take a drastic step?
Thank you very much. I think we'll. Pardon? Okay, last question. Yeah.
Yeah, so from a capitalist point of view, farming in India has turned into a non-viable part of the economy. Essentially, parts of the other parts of the economy are propping it up. It is bad for the environment. You've given a couple of solutions about corporatization, making cooperatives, and then trying to support farming in that area. Are there any real viable solutions? For example, MSP is not a solution. Just increasing support prices is not a solution. Are there any serious solutions that we have for farming in India?
Yeah, I'll start with this, Dr. Jodhka. Yeah. Show me a single country in the world where agriculture is not state supported. Any single country, take United States of America, 12,000, 20,000 cotton farmers, gives an annual subsidy of about $8 billion. That's almost like 35,000 rupees an acre. Go to Switzerland, look at their subsidies, that's how they can buy bread. Nowhere in the world is agriculture not state supported, period. Viable solutions, I think, that Kaka's pointer that his land is turning infertile. Fertility is an issue. And that's what I'm making a point, that so far we are only dealing with the problems in agriculture, the economics of it, the social problems, and the disconnect between the urban society and the agriculture colleges not performing. But his problem actually emanates from my second point, which I'm arguing my thrust is more these days on that, is that problem of agriculture. It takes about 1,000 years to produce 1 inch of topsoil. And topsoil is where everything happens with regard to, crop being good or bad, productivity being good or bad. It takes about 1,000 years. So Kaka, you will have to wait about 1,000 years for your soil to get really good. If you, we have made, over periods, we have made so many interventions. So it's like speaking one lie and then trying to cover it up, we keep speaking lies after lies. We have, the industrial agriculture is a problem. The industrial mode of agriculture is a problem. Agriculture is a system where perennial, livestock, agroclimatic, water, all these things have to be looked at holistically. You cannot fix one and say, okay, we are fixing the system. You cannot fix the market and you say, we are fixing the agriculture system. So I think we have to look at agriculture as a system, producing food, and also soil being an intrinsic part of that civilizational milieu. We've done enough of devastation on that front.
Just to respond to both these sets of questions here about contract farming and the den of, there's this the question at the back. There is this theory in economics by Arthur Lewis, who was an economist at the London School of Economics, where I work. And it's called the Lewis turning point from his research, where our assumption of civilization in any society is the Lewis turning point, when the surplus, because we're assuming rural labor will go to urban, because rural is not a place worth living. agriculture is not worth doing. So unless that switch happens where you have an excess of labor, where you have in the fall in labor so that wages rise, you're not really a developed economy. So basically the takeaway on that is being rural, being an agrarian based economy is a bad thing. This has become hegemonic in our thinking. And India is a country that doesn't fit this bill. 75% of the country is rural. So you have to push back. You have to think about a different way of thinking about the rural. I quote Ambedkar's statement about the village being a den of vice, and I very respectfully disagree with it, not because I'm saying it is a heaven, but because if there is caste in village, you show me an urban area in India where there is no caste. We talk about caste as if it exists only in the village. You think there's no caste in, does Jaipur not have caste? Are people not marrying according to caste and living according to caste ghettos and eating according to who is vegetarian? On the train from Delhi to Jaipur, I saw this man just told this other one, "Aap udhar khaiye, hamara vegetarian birth hai." I mean, there are things going on in urban India which we blame on rural India, which are happening in urban India. About contract farming, it's not so much. There's a big elephant in the room that we haven't talked about, which is agrarian markets. And agricultural markets need reform. Our colleagues, Mekhla Krishnamurthy and others are working on this. There is a whole discussion to be had, not just about labor and soil, but how we sell the crop. But at the heart of whatever kind of farming you do, you've got to have a question about labor pricing, and even more ineffably, the issue of dignity. And that is critical.
Just final last minute, because our time is up. I think all these questions that have come up, they're very valid questions at some level. And these questions work with this larger established technocratic model of thinking about economies. And if we were to think from technocratic models, we virtually have no hope. Where is this 60% population going to go? Which agriculture in India today does not need more than 10% of working population. It can easily do with 10% of working population. It absorbs something around 50% minimum of working population. It's a sponge for the economy. Where is this sponge going to go? If you bring those 40% people in the city, how are you going to live in this life? So we have to think differently. And the lead to it is to not only be seen in technocratic terms through economic language that, yeah, maybe we should create all these non-farm employments, which anyway are happening. They are innovating. There more income in rural India comes from non-farm activities, but they are pathetic incomes. They're not valued incomes. They come here and work on construction sites and they live very undignified lives, and there are all kinds of violences involved in that. So the point that we are making in this session, that's where we started, that why don't we take this point from the farmers movement themselves, that they have their voice. They are suggesting something different, which we need to talk about. What is soil? That's why soil is not simply land where wheat has to be grown. It is also mitti with which we relate emotionally, but it is also civilizational. If there is a history of 5,000 years, that cannot be reduced to history of these last 200 years post-industrial revolution world or last 75 years of India's development. And I think that's where our session concludes. Our time is over. Up now, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you for attending the session.
I have a real affection for panelists who end their session right on time, right on clock. It really helps the festival. We'd like to thank Jaideep Hardikar, Mukulika Banerjee, and Surinder S. Jodhka for that deeply insightful discussion and an exploration into the economics of soil. We also thank Escorts for their support, and we hope to see you at the next session at the Darbar Hall. Thank you, and see you in about 10 minutes.